Continuing where I left off, chapter 13. That same night, Rostov was with a platoon on the skirmish line in front of Bagration's detachment. His hussars were posted along the line in pairs, while he himself kept riding up and down, trying to overcome his almost overwhelming drowsiness. In the vast expanses behind him, he could see the campfires of our army dimly glowing through the fog. Before him lay the misty darkness. However intently he peered into this murky distance, he could see nothing. Now something gleamed gray. Now something looked black. Now little lights seemed to glimmer in the distance where the enemy was supposed to be. Now he fancied this glimmering was a trick of his eyes, which kept closing. First the Tsar, then Denisov, then memories of Moscow appeared in his imagination. He made haste to open his eyes again and saw immediately before him only the head and ears of the horse he was riding, or when he came within 6 paces of them, the black figures of the hussars. But in the distance still the same misty darkness. Why not? It might easily happen, mused Rostov, that the Tsar, encountering me, would give me a commission, as he might to any officer, and say, "Go, and find out what's over there." There are many stories of how, quite by chance, he got to know an officer and attached him to himself. What if he were to give me a place near him? Oh, how I would guard him! Oh, how I would tell him the whole truth! How I would expose those who betrayed him! And in order vividly to depict to himself his love and devotion to his sovereign, he pictured an enemy or a treacherous German, whom he would not only kill with pleasure, but whose face he would slap before the Tsar's eyes. Where am I? Oh yes, on the skirmish line. Password and watchword, Shaft, Omuts. How disappointing that our squadron would be held in reserve tomorrow. He thought, I'll ask to be sent to the front. It may be my only chance of seeing the Tsar. Yes, I'll soon be relieved. I'll ride round once more, and when I get back I shall go to the general and ask him. He drew himself up in the saddle and set out to make another tour of his hussars. It seemed to him that it was growing lighter. On the left he saw a declivity, the side of which appeared to be lighted up, and, opposite, a black knoll that looked as steep as a wall. On this knoll was a white patch that Rostov could not make out. Was it a glade in the woods lit up by the moon, or unmelted snow, or white houses? He even thought he saw something move on that white patch. It must be snow. That spot. A spot. Une tache. Natasha, my sister, her black eyes. Natasha. Won't she be surprised when I tell her I've seen the Tsar? Natasha. Take my sabretech. Keep to the right, Your Honor. There are bushes here, came the voice of a hussar past whom Rostov was riding as he dozed off. Rostov abruptly lifted his head, which had sunk almost to his horse's mane, and pulled up beside the hussar. He could not shake off the childish sleepiness that had overcome him. But what was I thinking? I mustn't forget. How I shall speak to the Tsar. No, that's not it. That's tomorrow. Oh, yes. Natasha. Sebertek. To the task. To the attack. Who? The hussars. Ah, hussars with mustaches. Along Tverskaya Boulevard rode the hussar with the mustache. I was thinking about him too, just opposite Guryev's house. Or old Guryev. Ah, and Denisov is a fine fellow. But all that is nonsense. The great thing now is the Tsar is here. How he looked at me and wanted to say something, but he didn't dare. No, it was I who didn't dare. But that's all nonsense. The chief thing is not to forget the important thing I was thinking. Yes, Natasha. Sabertet. Yes, that's right. And once again his head sank down to his horse's neck. All at once it seemed to him that he was being fired at. What? Cut them down. What? He said, waking up. At that moment he opened his eyes. Rostov heard in front of him, coming from the direction of the enemy, the prolonged shouting of thousands of voices. His horse and the horse of the hussar near him pricked up their ears at these cries. In the region from which the shouting came, a fire flared up and subsided. Then another. And all along the French line on the hillside fires were lighted, and the shouting grew louder and louder. Rostov heard the sound of French, though he could not distinguish the words. The din of many voices was too great. All he could hear was, "Ah!" and "Roar!" "What is it? What do you think?" asked Rostov, turning to the hussar beside him. "It's in the enemy camp, isn't it?" The hussar did not reply. "Well, don't you hear it?" Rostov asked again after waiting long enough for an answer. "Well, who can tell, your honor?" The hussar hesitantly replied. "According to the direction, it must be the enemy," Rostov repeated. "Might be them, might be nothing," said the hussar. "It's so dark." "Steady now," he shouted to his horse, which was growing restive. Rostov's horse was also becoming impatient, and pawed the frozen ground, pricked up its ears, and looked in the direction of the fires. The shouting continued to grow louder and louder, blending into a general roar that could come only from an army of several thousand men. The fires extended farther and farther along what must have been the line of the French camp. Rostov was no longer sleepy. The elated, jubilant shouts of the enemy had a stimulating effect on him. "Vive l'Empereur! L'Empereur!" he now heard distinctively. "They can't be far off, probably just beyond the stream," he said to the hussar beside him. The hussar only sighed without replying, then cleared his throat indignantly. They heard the sound of a horse trotting along the line, and suddenly, out of the darkness, the figure of a sergeant of hussars loomed like a huge elephant. "Your honor, the generals," said the sergeant, riding up to the Rostov. Still peering in the direction of the fires and the shouting, Rostov rode with the sergeant to meet several men who were riding along the line. One was on a white horse. Prince Bagration and Prince Dolgorukov had come out with their adjutants to observe the curious phenomenon of the fires and the shouting in the enemy camp. Rostov rode up to Prince Bagration and reported to him, then joined the adjutants and listened to what the generals were saying. "Believe me," Prince Dolgorukov was saying to Bagration, "it's nothing but a trick. He has retreated and ordered the rear guard to light fires and make a racket to deceive us." "Hardly," said Bagration. "I saw them this evening on that knoll. If they had retreated, they would have withdrawn from there too." "Officer," he said, turning to Rostov, "are their pickets still posted there?" "They were this evening, but now I can't be sure, Your Excellency." "Shall I take some hussars and find out?" asked Rostov. Bagration hesitated, and before replying, to see Rostov's face in the mist. "Well, go and see," he said after a brief pause. "Yes, sir." Rostov spurred his horse, called Sergeant Fedchenko and two other hussars, ordered them to follow him, and trotted down the hill in the direction of the shouting, which still continued. Rostov felt a mingled dread and delight to be riding alone with three hussars into that mysterious, dangerous, murky distance where no one had been before him. Bagration shouted to him from the hill not to go beyond the stream, but he pretended not to hear him, and, without stopping, rode farther and farther, repeatedly mistaking bushes for trees and hollows for men, and then discovering his error. Once he had descended the hill, he could no longer see either our own or the enemy's fires, but the shouting of the French became louder and more distinct. In the valley he saw ahead of him something that looked like a river, but when he reached it, he found it was a road. Coming out onto the road, he reined in his horse, uncertain whether to follow it or cross it and ride over the black field and up the hillside. To keep to the road, which gleamed white through the mist, was less dangerous because it would be easier to see anyone coming along it. "Follow me," he ordered, and crossing the road began to gallop up the hill toward the point where the French pickets had been posted that evening. "There he is, Your Honor," exclaimed one of the hussars behind him. And before Rostov had time to make out the dark object that had suddenly appeared in the fog, there was a flash followed by a report, and a bullet whistled plaintively through the air and out of hearing. Another gun misfired but flashed in the pan. Rostov turned his horse and galloped back. 4 more reports rang out at intervals, and more bullets, each singing on a different note, passed into the mist. Rostov heard in his horse, which was as exhilarated as he by firing, and rode at a walking pace. "Come on, keep it up, keep it up!" An elated voice within was saying, but there were no more shots. Not till he was approaching Bagration did Rostov put his horse to a gallop again, and he rode up to the general with his hand raised to his cap in a salute. Dokhtúrov was still contending that the French had retreated and had lit the fires only to deceive us. "What does it prove?" he was saying as Rostov rode up to them. "They could retreat and leave their pickets. It's clear they have not gone yet, Prince Bagration. Wait till tomorrow morning. Tomorrow we shall know everything." "The picket is still on the hill, Your Excellency, right where he was in the evening," reported Rostov, bending forward. His hand held the salute, unable to suppress the smile of delight evoked by his expedition, and especially by the sound of the bullets. "Good, good," said Bagration. "Thank you, officer." "Your Excellency," said Rostov, "may I make a request?" "What is it?" "Tomorrow our squadron is to be held in reserve. May I ask to be attached to the first squadron?" "What is your name?" "Count Rostov." "Ah, good. You may remain with me as orderly officer." "Ilya Andrich's son," asked Dokhtúrov. Rostov made no reply. "Then I may rely on it, Your Excellency. I will give the order." "Tomorrow, very likely, I shall be sent to the Emperor with a message," thought Rostov. "Thank God." The fires in the shouting enemy camps were caused by the fact that while Napoleon's order was being read to the troops, the Emperor himself had ridden through the bivouacs. On seeing him, the soldiers had twisted tufts of straw into torches and had run after him shouting, "Viva Emperor!" Napoleon's orders were as follows: "Soldiers, the Russian army is advancing against you to avenge the Austrian army of Ulm. These are the same battalions you defeated at Hollabrunn, and which ever since you have been pursuing to this place. The position we occupied is a strong one. If they advance to outflank me on the right, they will expose their flank to me. Soldiers, I myself will lead your battalions. I will keep out of range of fire if you, with your customary valor, bring about disorder and confusion in the enemy ranks. But should victory be in doubt even for a moment, you will see your emperor expose himself to the first blows of the enemy, for there must be no uncertainty of victory, especially on this day when the honor of the French infantry, on which rests the honor of our nation, is at stake. Do not break ranks on the pretext of removing the wounded. Let every man be thoroughly imbued with the thought that we must defeat these hirelings of England, who are inspired by such hatred of our nation. This victory will conclude our campaign, and we can return to winter quarters where fresh troops, now being raised in France, will join us. Then the peace I shall conclude will be worthy of my people, of you, and of myself, Napoleon." Chapter 14. At 5 o'clock in the morning, it was still quite dark. The troops of the center, the reserves, the Bagration's right flank, had not yet moved. But on the left flank, the columns of infantry, cavalry, and artillery that were to be the first to descend from the heights to attack the French right flank and, according to the disposition, to drive it back into the Bohemian highlands were already up and stirring. The smoke of the campfires, into which everything superfluous was being thrown, made the eyes smart. It was cold and dark. The officers were hurriedly drinking tea and breakfasting. The soldiers were crowded around the fires, munching rusk and beating a tattoo with their feet to warm themselves. They made firewood of the remains of the huts, chairs, tables, wheels, tubs, everything they did not need or that could not be taken with them. The Austrian column guides, serving as heralds of the advance, moved in and out among the troops. The moment an Austrian officer appeared near a regimental commander's quarter, the regiment began to move. The soldiers ran from the fires, thrust their pipes into their bootlegs, threw their bags into the baggage wagon, stripped their arms, and formed ranks. The officers buttoned their coats, buckled on their sabers and pouches, and strode up and down the ranks shouting. The orderlies and drivers harnessed and packed the wagons and tied on the loads. The adjutants, the battalion, the regimental commanders mounted, crossed themselves, gave final instructions, orders, and commissions to the men remaining with the baggage train, and the monotonous tramp of thousands of feet resounded. The columns moved forward, not knowing where they were going, and because of the surrounding masses of men, the smoke, and the increasing fog, unable to see either the place to which they were going or the one they were leaving. A soldier on the march is as encompassed, confined, and borne along by his regiment as a sailor by his ship. However far he goes, whatever strong, unknown, and dangerous regions he may penetrate, just as the sailor is always surrounded by the same decks, masts, and rigging of his ship, so the soldiers have always and everywhere the same comrades, the same ranks, the same Sergeant Major Ivan Mitrich, the same company dog Zuka, the same officers. The soldier is like the sailor, who rarely cares to know the latitude in which his ship is sailing, and yet, on the day of a battle, God knows how or whence it comes, in the moral atmosphere of the troops, the same stern note is heard by all, sounding the approach of something solemn and crucial, and awakening them in an unwonted curiosity. On the day of a battle, the soldiers excitedly try to transcend regimental interest and intently listen, watch, and eagerly inquire about what is going on around them. The fog had become so dense that though it was growing light, they could not see 10 paces in front of them. Bushes looked like huge trees, and level ground like cliffs and hollows. Anywhere on any side one might stumble on the enemy one could not see 10 paces off. But the columns moved on for a long time, always in that same fog, uphill, downhill, passing fences, gardens, going through new and unknown country, and nowhere encountering the enemy. On the contrary, the soldiers became aware that in front, behind, and on all sides, other Russian columns were moving in the same direction. Every soldier was heartened by knowing that wherever it was that he was going, many more of our men were going too. There now, the Kurskys have gone on too, they were saying in the ranks. It's great, lads, what forces we've mustered. I was looking at our campfires last night. No end of them, a regular Moscow. Though none of the column commanders approached the ranks or talked to the men, as we seen at the council of war, the commanders were so disgruntled and dissatisfied with the business in hand that they merely carried out orders without exerting themselves to cheer the men. Yet the troops marched buoyantly, as they always do when going into action, especially when they are taking the offense. But after they had been marching for about an hour in the dense fog, the greater part of the army was forced to halt, and an unpleasant awareness of disorder and confusion spread through the ranks. How such an awareness is communicated is very difficult to define, but there is no doubt that it is communicated with an extraordinary speed and accuracy, spreading as imperceptibly and inevitably as water seeping into a dell. Had the Russian army been alone, without allies, it might possibly have taken a long time for this consciousness of confusion to become a general conviction. But in the circumstances, it was particularly pleasant and natural to ascribe the disorder to the stupid Germans, and everyone was convinced that a dangerous muddle had been penetrated by the sausage-eaters. Why have they stopped? Is the way blocked? Have we already run up against the French? No. You don't hear anything. They start firing if we had. They were in such a hurry to get us started, so we started, and here we stand in the middle of a field for no reason. Those damn Germans make a mess of everything. What stupid devils. Now what I'll do, I'll send them on ahead. But you can be sure they'll huddle up in the rear, and here we're stuck without eating. What about it? Can we move soon? They say the cavalry is blocking the way, said an officer. Ah, these damn Germans don't even know their own country, said another. What divisions are you? Shouted an adjutant riding up. 18th. Then what are you doing here? You should have been up front long ago. Now you won't get there before nightfall. What idiotic orders. They don't know themselves what they are doing, said the officer and rode on. Then a general rode past, angrily shouting something not in Russian. Tafalafa! And what he's jabbering no one can make out, said a soldier, mimicking the general who had ridden on. I'll shoot the lot of them, the scoundrels. Our orders are to be there before 10, and we haven't gone halfway. Fine orders those are, was heard on all sides. And the feeling of energy with which the troops had started began to turn into resentment and anger at the senseless arrangement and at the Germans. The muddle was caused by the fact that while the Austrian cavalry was moving toward our left flank, the High Command found that our center was too far removed from the right flank, and the cavalry were all ordered to cross to the right side. As several thousand cavalry passed in front of them, the infantry had to wait. An altercation had arisen between an Austrian guide and a Russian general. The Russian general shouted, demanding that the cavalry be stopped. The Austrian officer argued that not he, but the High Command was to blame. Meanwhile, the troops were at standstill, growing apathetic and dispirited. After an hour's delay, they at last moved on, descending the hill. The fog, which had been lifting on the heights, lay as thick as ever below. Where the troops were descending, in the mist ahead, a shot rang out, then another. At first, the firing came at irregular intervals. Trat-tat, tat, and then more rapidly and regularly, and the action at the Goldback stream began. Not expecting to come on an enemy down by the stream and stumbling on him unawares in the fog, hearing no word of encouragement from the commanding officers, with the consciousness of being too late spreading through the ranks, and above all being unable to see anything before or around them in the thick fog, the Russians tardily and listlessly exchanged shots with the enemy, advancing and again halting, never receiving a command in time from the officers and adjutants, who were wandering about the fog over unfamiliar terrain, unable to find their own units. Thus begun the action for the first, second, and third columns, which had gone down the hill. The fourth column, with which Kutuzov was, stood on the Pratzen Heights. Below, where the engagement had begun, there was still thick fog. Higher up, it was beginning to clear, but nothing could be seen of what was going on in front. Whether all the enemy forces were, as we suppose, 10 versts away, or whether they were nearby in the fog belt, no one knew till 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock came. The fog, like an endless sea, spread out below. But in the village of Chatplanitz, where Napoleon stood on an eminence surrounded by his marshals, it was quite light. Above him was a clear blue sky, and the sun's huge orb quivered like a hollow crimson buoy on the surface of that milky sea of mist. The whole French army, and even Napoleon himself with his staff, were not on the far side of the streams and lowland of the villages of Salkonitz and Chatplanitz, beyond which we intended to take up our positions and begin the attack, but on the near side, so close to our forces that Napoleon could distinguish a cavalryman from an infantryman with his naked eye. Napoleon, in the same blue greatcoat he had worn throughout his Italian campaign, was on a small gray Arab horse, a little in front of his marshals. He peered in silence at the hills rising out of the sea of mist, on which the Russian troops were moving in the distance, and listened to the sounds of firing in the valley. Not a single muscle of his face, which in those days was still thin, moved. His glittering eyes were intently fixed on one spot. His conjectures were proving to be correct. Part of the Russian forces had already descended into the valley and were moving toward the ponds and lakes. Part were evacuating those Pratzen Heights which he considered the key to the position and intended to attack. He saw through the fog, in a hollow between two hills near the village of Pratzen, the glint of bayonets as one after another the Russian columns, moving always in the same direction toward the valleys, vanished into the sea of mist. From information he had received the evening before, from the sounds of wheels and footsteps, he had heard the night at the outpost from the disorderly movement of the Russian columns, and from all his speculation he clearly realized that the Allies believed him to be a long way in front of them, that the columns moving in the vicinity of Pratzen constituted the center of the Russian army, and that this center was already sufficiently weakened to be successfully attacked. But still he did not begin the engagement. That day was for him a day of triumph. It was the anniversary of his coronation. He had slept for a few hours in the early morning, and refreshed, vigorous, and in good spirits, he mounted his horse and rode out into the field in that happy frame of mind in which everything seems possible and everything succeeds. He sat motionless, looking at the heights visible above the mist, and his cold face wore the peculiar look of confident, self-complacent happiness that one sees on the face of a boy who is happy in love. The marshals remained behind him, not daring to distract his attention. He looked now at the Pratzen heights, now at the sun floating up out of the mist. When the sun had completely emerged from the fog, and the field and the mists were bathed in its dazzling light, as though he had only been waiting for this to begin, he drew the glove from his shapely white hand, made a sign with it to his marshals, and gave the order for the action to begin. The marshals, accompanied by adjutants, galloped off in various directions, and a few minutes later the main forces of the French army were rapidly moving toward those Pratzen heights which were being steadily evacuated by the Russian troops descending into the valley to the left. Chapter 15. At 8 o'clock, Kutuzov rode to Pratzen at the head of Miloradich's fourth column, the one that was to replace Perbeswski's and Lodgerin's column, which had already descended the hill. He greeted the men in the foremost regiment and gave the command to advance, thereby indicating that he intended to lead the column himself. On reaching the village of Pratzen, he halted. Prince Andrei was behind him, among the immense number of men comprising the commander-in-chief's suite. Prince Andrei was in a state of excitement and nervous irritation, and at the same time of controlled calm, as a man is when some long-awaited moment has come. He was firmly convinced that this would be the day of his Toulon, or his bridge of Arcot. How it would come about he did not know, but he felt certain it would come. The locality and position of our troops were known to him, as far as they could be known to anyone in our army. His own strategic plan, which could not conceivably be executed now, was forgotten. Entering into Weyrother's plan, Prince Andrei was now considering possible contingencies and forming new combinations in which his rapidity of reasoning and decision might be required. To the left, down below in the mist, an exchange of fire between unseen forces could be heard. There, it seemed to Prince Andrei, the fighting would be concentrated. There the difficulties encountered. And there, he thought, I shall be sent with a brigade or a division, and in standard in hand I shall go forward, subduing all before me. Prince Andrei could not look unmoved at the standards of the passing battalions. Seeing them, he kept thinking that may be the very standard with which I shall lead the army forward. By morning, all that was left of the fog was a hoarfrost now turning to dew, but in the valleys the mist still lay like a milk-white sea. Nothing could be seen in the valley on the left, into which our troops had descended, and from whence came sounds of firing. Above the heights was a dark, clear sky, and to the right the great orb of the sun. In front, far off the distant shore of that sea of mist, rose some wooded knolls, and there, where the enemy was presumed to be, something discernible. On the right, guards were entering the fog bank with a sound of hoofbeats and wheels and an occasional glint of bayonets. To the left, beyond the village, similar masses of cavalry were moving up and vanishing into the sea of mist. In front and behind moved the infantry. The commander-in-chief stood at the end of the village, letting the troops pass by him. Kutuzov seemed worn and irascible that morning. The infantry marching by him halted without the command being given, apparently obstructed by something in front. Well, order them to form battalion columns and go around the village, he said angrily to a general who had ridden up. How is it you don't understand, Your Excellency, my dear sir, that to have them defile through these narrow village streets when we are marching against the enemy is impossible? I intended to reform on the other side of the village, Your Excellency, replied the general. Kutuzov laughed acrimoniously. A fine position to be in, deploying your front line in full sight of the enemy. Very fine. The enemy is still a long way off, Your Excellency, according to the disposition. The disposition, Kutuzov ejaculated sardonically. And who told you that? Kindly do as you are ordered. Yes, sir. Mon cher, whispered Nebesky to Prince Andrei, the old man is in a beastly mood. An Austrian officer in a white uniform with green plumes in his hat, galloped up to Kutuzov and asked in the Emperor's name whether the fourth column had advanced into action. Kutuzov turned away without answering, and his eyes happened to fall on Prince Andrei, who was beside him. Seeing Bolkonsky, his malevolent, recurrent expression softened, as if he were acknowledging that his adjutant was not to blame for what was happening. And still not answering the Austrian adjutant, he addressed Bolkonsky in French. "Go and see whether the 3rd Division has passed the village, mon cher. Tell them to halt and wait for my orders." Prince Andrei had no sooner started than the commander-in-chief stopped him, and asked whether the sharpshooters had been posted, he added. "What are they doing? What are they doing?" he muttered to himself, still not replying to the Austrian. Prince Andrei galloped off to carry out his order. Overtaking the battalions that continued to advance, he stopped the 3rd Division and ascertained that there actually were no sharpshooters in front of our columns. The colonel at the head of the regiment was astounded at the commander-in-chief's order to post sharpshooters. Up to that moment, he had been completely confident that there were other troops in front of him, and that the enemy could not be less than 10 versts away. There was, in fact, nothing to be seen in front of him except a barren slope hidden by a dense fog. Having delivered the commander-in-chief's order to rectify this omission, Prince Andrei galloped back. Kutuzov was still in the same place, his corpulent body slumped in the saddle with the lassitude of old age, and was not yawning wearily with his one eye closed. The troops had not yet moved, but were standing at order arms. All right, he said to Prince Andrei, and turned to the general, who, watch in hand, was saying it was time they started, as all the left flank columns had already gone down. "Plenty of time, Your Excellency," mumbled Kutuzov through a yawn. "Plenty of time," he repeated. At that moment, in the distance behind Kutuzov, was heard the sound of regiments saluting, which came rapidly nearer along the whole extended line of the advancing columns. Clearly, the object of these greetings was riding swiftly, when the soldiers of the regiment in front of which Kutuzov was standing began to shout. He rode off a little to one side, and screwing up his face, looked back. Along the road from Pratzen galloped what looked like a whole squadron of horsemen in uniforms of different colors. Side by side in front of him rode 2 men at a full gallop. One in a black uniform with a white plume in his hat rode a chestnut bobtail horse. The other, in a white uniform, was on a black horse. They were the 2 emperors, followed by their suites. Kutuzov, affecting the manner of an old soldier at the front, gave the command, "Attention!" and rode up to the emperor, saluting. His whole figure and manner were instantly transformed. He had the air of a subordinate who obeys without reasoning, with ostentatious respect, which clearly made a bad impression on Emperor Alexander, who rode up and saluted. This disagreeable impression, like a wisp of fog in a clear sky, floated across the youthful happy face of the emperor and vanished. After his illness was somewhat thinner than he had been at the review of Olmutz, where Bolkonsky had seen him for the first time abroad, but there was the same enchanting combination of majesty and gentleness in his fine gray eyes, the same capacity for a diversity of expression on his delicate lips, the same predominant look of innocent, good-hearted youth. At the Olmutz reviewed, he was more regal. Here he was more elated and energetic, slightly flushed after his 3-verse gallop. He reined in his horse, drew a sigh of relief, and glanced back at the equally young and animated faces of those in his suite. Czartoryski, Novosselsky, Prince Walowski, Stronganov, and the rest, all richly attired, high-spirited young men on handsome, well-groomed, fresh, and only slightly heated horses, had stopped behind the Tsar and were exchanging remarks and smiling. The Emperor Franz, a young man with a long ruddy face, sat very erect on his handsome black stallion, looking about in a leisurely, preoccupied manner. He called one of his white-clad adjutants and asked him something, probably asking what time they started, thought Prince Andrei, observing his old acquaintance with a smile he could not repress at the recollection of his audience at Brünn. The Emperor's suite was composed of picked young orderly officers, both Russian and Austrian, of the line regiments and the guards. Among them were grooms leading the Tsar's spare horses, beautiful animals, and embroidered caparisons. As when a window is thrown open and a breath of fresh country air enters a stuffy room, so the aura of youth, energy, and confidence of success was conveyed to Kutuzov's dispirited staff by his brilliant cavalcade of young men. "Why aren't you starting, Mikhail Yonovich?" the Tsar summarily asked Kutuzov, at the same time glancing courteously at the Emperor Franz. "I am waiting, Your Majesty," answered Kutuzov, bending forward respectfully. Frowning slightly, the Tsar cocked his ear to indicate that he had not heard. "Waiting, Your Majesty," repeated Kutuzov. Prince Andrei noticed that Kutuzov's upper lip twitched it, now naturally, as he said the word "waiting." Not all the columns have been assembled. The Tsar heard, but was obviously displeased with the reply. He shrugged his rather round shoulders and glanced at Novostosiltsev, who was near him, as if complaining of Kutuzov. You know, we are not on the Sarcisin medal, Mikhail Yovanovitch, where a parade is not begun till all the regiments are present, said the Tsar, with another glance at the Emperor Franz, as if inviting him, if not take part, at least to listen to what he was saying. But the Emperor Franz continued to look about him and pay no heed. That is just what I do not begin, sire, said Kutuzov in a ringing voice, as if to preclude the possibility of not being heard, and again his face twitched. That is why I do not begin, sire, because we are not on parade and not on the Tutsrid medal, he articulated clearly and distinctively. All those in the Tsar's suite instantly exchanged reproachful, disapproving glances. However old he may be, he most certainly should not speak like that, their glances seemed to say. The Emperor looked steadily, intently into Kutuzov's eye, waiting to hear whether he would say anything further. But Kutuzov, with respectfully bow his head, also seemed to be waiting. The silence lasted for about a minute. However, if it is your Majesty's command, said Kutuzov, raising his head and relapsing into his former tone of the dull, unreasoning, submissive general. He touched his horse, and having summoned Milodoratovich, the column commander, gave the order to advance. The troops again began to move, and 2 battalions of the Novgorod and one of the Aspirin regiment marched past the Emperor. As the Aspirin battalion marched by, the florid-faced Milodorich, without his greatcoat, but with all his orders on his uniform, and wearing a cocked hat with an enormous tuft of plumes on the side of his head, galloped smartly forward, and with a gallant salute reined in his horse before the Tsar. God be with you, General, said the Tsar. Mafu Sayar, we shall do all that is possible to do, responded Milodorich blithely, his poor French accent eliciting ironic smiles from the gentlemen of the suite. Milodorich wheeled his horse sharply and took a position behind the Tsar. Roused by the presence of their sovereign, the men of the Aspirin regiment, marching in step, passed the emperors and their suites at a brisk, spirited pace. Lads, shouted Milodorich in his loud, self-confident, exuberant voice, evidently so excited by the sound of firing, the prospect of battle, and the sight of the valiant Aspirins, his comrades under Suvorov, now marching smartly past the sovereigns, that he forgot the Tsar's presence. Lads, it's not the first village you had to take. We'll do our best, shouted the soldiers. The Tsar's horse reared at the sudden cry. This horse, which the Tsar had ridden at reviews in Russia, bore him here on the field of Arselis, patiently enduring the heedless jabs of his left foot, pricking up its ears at the sound of firing, just as it had done on the fields of Mars, with no comprehension of this firing, nor of the nearness of the Emperor Franz's black stallion, nor of all that was said, thought, and felt that day by its rider. The Tsar turned with a smile to one of the members of his suite, and pointing to the gallant aspirins, said something to him. And I'm going to leave it off there. Thank you for watching, and continue to watch. Please give it a thumbs up, thumbs down, leave a comment below, subscribe, or do nothing, and I'll see you in the next